In the cold silence of the dying empire, the last queen of humanity stood at the precipice of extinction, gazing out from the shattered balcony of the royal citadel, her gaze lost in the stars beyond those distant galaxies. Where once her people had reigned supreme, now nothing but darkness and ruin remained. The alien invaders known as the Axiloth had swept through the galaxy like locusts, leaving nothing but ashes and broken worlds. In their wake, humanity had been scattered like dust on the winds, its once mighty fleets shattered, and its great cities reduced to rubble. Even the most hopeful among her advisors whispered of defeat, their voices hollow as they walked through the corridors of the crumbling citadel. Those who had survived the war now faced the reality of annihilation, and the queen could feel it in the air, the weight of inevitability pressing down on her shoulders. Her name was Eliana, the last descendant of a lineage that had once governed the stars with wisdom and strength, a line of rulers who had created empires that stretched across the heavens. Now, she stood alone as the last hope for the remnants of humanity. But even she knew that hope was a fragile thing and time was running out. That Axiloth had proven to be an unstoppable force, their technology and armies beyond anything humanity had ever encountered. The queen had watched as entire worlds fell to them one after another, each battle a reminder of how fragile they truly were, each loss a wound that would never heal. The once vibrant capital city of her home world had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. The streets, now empty and silent, only the echo of the past lingered in the walls as the queen's advisors and soldiers gathered in secret to discuss their plans for the final defense. She could feel their eyes on her every moment, the weight of expectation pressing down on her every decision. And yet no plan seemed sufficient to face the wrath of the Axiloth. They were too many, too powerful, and the queen knew that if she failed, her people would cease to exist. Her only remaining weapon was her crown, a symbol of power passed down through the generations, forged in the heart of dying stars, and imbued with the ancient magic of her ancestors. The crown was said to hold the power to turn the tide of any battle, but it had never been fully awakened. It was a relic of a bygone age, its power locked away. And now, as the last queen of humanity, Eliana knew it was time to unlock it, to use it in the final stand against the Axiloth. But there was a price for such power, a price she was unwilling to pay, but one she would have to face nonetheless. As the queen stood before her advisors, the decision loomed over her like a storm waiting to break. The crown held the promise of victory, but it could only be wielded by someone who was willing to sacrifice everything to embrace its full potential. And Eliana had never been one to take such a step before. She had been a ruler, a leader, a symbol of hope, but never a warrior. And now, as the final battle drew near, she knew that the time for symbols had passed, the time for sacrifices had arrived. She could no longer sit in her palace and command others to fight while she remained untouched by the horrors of war. It was time for her to become something else, to become a warrior and lead her people into the battle that would determine the fate of their entire race. But as she stood there at the edge of the citadel, staring out into the blackness of space, she realized that her choice would not just determine the fate of her people, it would determine the fate of humanity itself. That Axiloth were not just invaders, they were an existential threat to everything her people had ever built, their culture, their history, their very way of life. And if she did not act now, they would be lost forever. The wind howled through the broken windows of the citadel as the queen made her decision. She would sacrifice her crown and her title. She would take up the mantle of a warrior and lead humanity in its final stand against the darkness. No matter the cost, no matter the sacrifice, she would fight. And she would die if it meant ensuring the survival of her people. Her heart heavy with the weight of her decision, she turned from the balcony and walked toward the ancient forge where the fate of her crown and her people would be sealed. The royal chambers were darkened by the weight of centuries as Eliana entered the ancient forge where the destiny of her people would be decided. The air was thick with the scent of old iron and stardust, the walls etched with symbols of forgotten wars and victories that seemed like myths to the survivors of her time. The forge was where the first crown of her ancestors had been crafted, where it had been tempered by the fires of stars themselves. Now, it would be the place where her own crown would be undone and transformed into something far more dangerous than anything her ancestors could have ever imagined. Her steps echoed through the silence of the forge as she moved toward the central pedestal where the crown rested. It was an artifact of unimaginable power, forged from the heart of a dying star, a gift from the gods of old to the first queen of her line. Its intricate designs glowed faintly in the dark, its surface alive with the hum of ancient energy. Eliana had never worn it, for its full potential had always been sealed away. No one had dared to unleash its power for fear of what it might demand of them, but now she had no choice. That Tyloth were coming, and if they were to be stopped, the crown would need to be melted down and transformed into a weapon capable of destroying the invaders once and for all. Her fingers brushed against the cold surface of the crown as she hesitated for just a moment, the weight of the decision sinking deep into her soul. This crown had been her birthright. It had been the symbol of her rule and her family's reign. It had given her the authority to command armies and inspire loyalty in her people. But it had never truly been hers. She had always known that the crown was not meant for peace or diplomacy. It was meant for war. And now the time had come for war to consume her once and for all. With a deep breath, Eliana lifted the crown from its pedestal, the metal heavy in her hands, the weight of it a reminder of all that had been lost, and all that might still be lost. She walked to the heart of the forge, where the flames of the ancient furnace rolled to life, the flames that had forged her ancestors' weapons. And their crown, the furnace, was a relic of an age long past. Its power was legendary, but its dangers had been forgotten as the wars of old faded into myth. Eliana knelt before it and placed the crown into the fiery heart of the furnace. The molten energy surged around the relic as it began to shift and dissolve, the crown no longer a symbol of her power, but the beginning of something greater. As the crown melted, Eliana felt the heat of the flames wash over her body. She could sense the energy of the crown being absorbed into the very fabric of the forge, the power of stars and magic coalescing into something new, something raw and primal. The flames licked at her skin, but she did not flinch. She was no longer a queen, bound by the expectations of her people. She was something else now. She was the weapon humanity needed her to be. She felt the transformation begin as the crown disintegrated, its energies flowing into her veins. Her heart raced as her body began to change, as if the very essence of the universe was being infused into her flesh. Her muscles strengthened, and her senses sharpened. The crown was no longer a piece of jewelry. It was becoming part of her, the final remnant of her ancestors, now coursing through her like fire in her blood. The crown's energies filled the forge until it seemed to burn brighter than any star, its heat intense, but strangely invigorating. And as the molten metal flowed and reformed the shape of what was to come, Eliana felt her mind clear. The noise of the past, the doubts, the fears, the questions, they all vanished, leaving only one singular thought: that Tyloth would not destroy her people, not as she had any say in the matter. The flames continued to roar around her as the transformation completed. The crown was no longer a crown. It was armor crafted from the very heart of the universe, forged by the furnace's flame into something far beyond anything she had ever imagined. Its shape was fluid and powerful, like the embodiment of war itself. Sleek yet imposing, the armor glowed with a light that was both otherworldly and terrifying. It was not the symbol of a ruler. It was the symbol of a warrior, a weapon of pure destruction. Eliana stood tall as she gazed at the armor that had taken the place of her crown. It pulsed with energy and life, and she knew at that moment that nothing in the universe could stand against her. Now the time for waiting had ended. The time for war had begun. The queen was dead, but a new force had risen in her place, the last warrior of humanity. The armor clung to Eliana's body like a second skin, its form shifting with her every movement. The molten metal had hardened into plates of intricate design, each one reflecting the power of the crown. It had once been, yet now it was far more than that. The armor was alive with the energy of the stars. It had been forged from its light, a constant reminder of the sacrifice that had been made to create it. The air around her crackled with the weight of its power, and Eliana could feel her entire being pulsating with the strength of humanity's last hope. As she stood before the forge, a wave of unfamiliar sensations washed over her. The sheer force of the transformation was overwhelming. Her body felt stronger, her senses clearer. The quiet hum of the armor's power seemed to reverberate within her bones. And yet, there was something else, a connection to something much older than herself, to the ancient warriors who had once worn such armor in the wars that had shaped the galaxy before the rise of her people. It was as if the spirits of those warriors were living inside her, now guiding her movements and lending their strength to her cause. The weight of responsibility settled over her once more, but this time it did not feel like a burden. It felt like a call to arms, a purpose that ran deeper than any crown ever. She was no longer the ruler of a decaying empire. She was the protector of humanity, the last line of defense against the Azeroth. And as the armor settled into place around her, she realized with startling clarity that there would be no turning back from this moment. No retreat, no negotiation, no peace, only war, and the final fight for survival. Her heart raced with a mix of fear and exhilaration. But it was not fear of dying, it was fear of failing her people, of failing those who had already given everything in this war, and of failing the generations that had come before her, the warriors whose sacrifices had paved the way for her to stand here now. Eliana took a deep breath, her hand gripping the hilt of the sword that had materialized in the forge beside her. It was unlike any blade she had ever seen. Its edge seemed to shimmer with an ethereal light, its grit firm and cool in her hand. And she knew at that moment that this was her weapon, this was the key to victory. She turned toward the door of the forge, her mind set on the future ahead. She had no time for hesitation, no time for doubt. The Tyler fleet was already on its way to her homeworld, their ships darkening the skies above, and the time for waiting had long since passed. Humanity had no more time to waste. If she was to lead them into battle, it had to be now. As she stepped out of the forge, the cold air of the royal citadel struck her face for the first time in years. She felt the weight of her transformation. She was not the queen who had once ruled with compassion and grace. She was the warrior who would fight with fury and strength, the remnants of humanity's hope, now concentrated in the form of one woman and her deadly armor. The citadel had long since been emptied of civilians, the survivors now gathered in secret bases deep within the planet's surface. But she knew that the people still believed in her, they still looked to her for leadership, even as she had abandoned her crown to become something more. Eliana walked through the desolate hallways of the citadel, her steps echoing in the emptiness, each footfall a reminder of the sacrifice she had made to get here. She would not fail them now. Her mind was sharp and focused. Every decision she had made had led to this moment. Every loss, every victory had been a step toward this final battle. And now she would give everything she had left to ensure that humanity would survive, that Azeroth would know her name, they would fear her as a warrior, and they would learn what it meant to face the full fury of the last of the human race. Outside the citadel, the sky was darkening with the approach of the Azeroth fleet, their ships blotting out the stars with their sheer numbers. But Eliana did not flinch. She stood tall, her heart beating in rhythm with the pulse of the armor that now encased her body. She was no longer the last queen of a dying empire. She was the last warrior of humanity, and she would fight until her last breath, if that was what it took to save her people. Eliana stood at the edge of the citadel, her eyes locked on the horizon, where the Tyler fleet was slowly descending like a swarm of locusts, casting a shadow over the land. The ground trembled beneath her, as if the very earth was aware of the imminent destruction. She could feel the presence of the enemy, even from this distance. Their ships were massive, and their technology far superior to anything humanity had ever dreamed of. But what they did not understand was the strength of a dying race desperate to survive. What they did not know was that Eliana was not merely the last queen of a fallen empire, she was the culmination of all the sacrifice and resilience of her people, the embodiment of humanity's will to endure. The armor she wore was a manifestation of that, while it pulsed with energy that seemed to reverberate through her very bones. It had been forged, not just from the molten crown, but from the spirit of her ancestors, the warriors who had fought and bled to protect their homes long before her time. Now that power coursed through her, and she felt an unbreakable connection to all who had come before her. They had all faced their final battles and fallen, but she would not fall, not today, not until she had taken every last breath in the fight for survival. Her soldiers had already begun mobilizing beneath the citadel, their weapons ready, their spirits uncertain. But when they saw her, they would know what they were fighting for. The last warrior of humanity had risen, and she would lead them into battle with the fury of 1,000 generations. The winds howled around her as she took her first step toward the battlefields below the citadel's crumbling walls, the air thick with the scent of smoke and blood, the ground littered with the remnants of past battles. But Eliana did not hesitate. She walked with purpose, her steps strong and sure. The weight of the armor no longer felt like a burden, but a part of her, a part of the unstoppable force that was humanity's last stand. As she descended the steps of the citadel, the soldiers who had once looked to her for guidance as a queen now looked at her with new eyes. They saw her not as a ruler, but as a warrior, a symbol of everything they had fought for and everything they had lost. She was their beacon in the dark. And as she passed them, the silence was broken by the sound of armor clanking and weapons being drawn. They had seen the power of her transformation. They had witnessed the change in her, the once delicate queen, now a warrior forged from the very heart of humanity's legacy, and they were ready to follow her into whatever battle awaited them. Eliana reached the ground where the command center was set up, surrounded by troops, preparing their final defenses. The distant rumble of the alien ships could be heard as they entered the planet's atmosphere and began to position themselves above the horizon. Their sleek ships glinted in the light of the setting sun as they prepared to unleash their might upon the world below. But Eliana felt no fear, no hesitation. She had been forged for this moment, and nothing would stop her from delivering humanity's final message to the invaders. She turned to her soldiers, her voice steady and commanding as she addressed them. Today we fight not for a crown, but for our people, for everything we have lost and everything we will gain from this moment forward. We are not just survivors, we are the last warriors of a dying race. And we will not go quietly into the night. That Tyloth will learn that humanity will never be erased. We will fight until the last breath, if that is what it takes to save our future. Her words echoed through the ranks, and for the first time in what felt like ages, there was a spark of hope in the eyes of the soldiers. They had seen their homes destroyed, their families scattered, their cities reduced to dust. But now they saw something else in Eliana. They saw strength. They saw the fury of a people unwilling to die without a fight. Eliana raised her sword high, the blade shimmering with the same energy that flowed through her armor, the light reflecting off its surface. As she faced the oncoming tide of Tyloth ships, her heart beat in time with the growing rumble of the battlefield, the ground shaking beneath her feet, as her soldiers lined up beside her, ready to follow her into the final battle for the survival of humanity. The time for hesitation was over. The war for their future had begun, and Eliana would lead them into the heart of the storm until the last of the Tyloth lay broken and defeated at her feet. The sky above was filled with the ominous hum of the Tyloth ships as they descended from the heavens, their massive forms blotting out the stars, the once serene atmosphere now charged with the energy of impending war. The ground trembled with each step. Eliana took her armor humming with power as she stood at the head of her soldiers. They were not many, but they were fierce, the last remnants of humanity's fighting force, and in her they saw something that none of the Tyloth could ever understand, a will to survive that no force in the universe could break. The Tyloth fleet began its assault in a thunderous wave of energy. The first barrage of fire lit up the sky as the alien ships unleashed their weapons. From above, the air crackled with the sound of disintegrating metal and the roar of destructive power. But Eliana stood her ground, her eyes fixed on the sky. She could feel the battle raging around her, yet she was calm. As the storm of war swirled at her feet, she had come to terms with the cost of this fight. The price of victory would be steep, but she would pay it. She would pay it gladly if it meant saving her people. She lifted her sword, the blade glowing brightly, as she locked her gaze on the nearest enemy ship. It was massive, a hulking mass of dark metal and pulsing energy, and it was heading straight for the heart of her forces. But Eliana had no fear as she raised her arm, the armor on her chest shimmering with energy, the molten power of the crown. Now part of her very being, she could feel the force of humanity's collective strength surging through her veins. She was not just a queen, she was a warrior, a weapon forged for this moment, and she would strike with everything she had. With a battle cry that echoed across the field, she charged forward, her feet pounding the earth as she sprinted toward the advancing Tyloth ship. The energy from her sword crackled through the air, lighting up the battlefield as her soldiers followed in her wake. They were small in number, but they were relentless, and they were fighting for a future that no one else would see if they failed. The first blast of Psylocke energy hit the ground just behind her, throwing dirt and rock into the air, but Eliana did not falter. Her sword was raised high, the glowing blade cutting through the air like a comet. On a collision course with destiny, the Psylocke ship was getting closer now. She could see the enemy's weapons charging, ready to fire again. But before they could unleash another barrage, Eliana leaped into the air, her sword striking down with the force of a collapsing star. The energy from the blade exploded outward as it sliced through the Psylocke ship's hull, its shields no match for the sheer power behind her blow. The ship shuddered and cracked as it began to break apart, pieces of the massive vessel raining down on the battlefield in fiery debris. The alien forces were stunned for a moment. The first blow had landed, and it had been devastating, but they were quick to respond as more ships descended from the sky, unleashing their fury upon Eliana and her forces. But the warrior who had once been a queen was undeterred. She struck again, and again, her sword cutting through the ranks of the invaders with precision and power. The armor she wore was an extension of her, with each movement a flawless display of the fury of humanity's final stand. She moved like a storm, cutting through the alien forces as her soldiers rallied behind her, their spirits lifted by her strength. The battlefield was chaos now that Psylocke unleashed wave after wave of energy, their weapons tearing apart the land around them. But Eliana was an unstoppable force, her armor glowing with the intensity of the battle, her sword cleaving through their ships and their soldiers alike. There was no stopping her, there was no defeating her. As long as she stood, the Psylocke would never claim victory. She moved across the battlefield with the precision of a predator, her sword slashing through the thick air, her heart beating in time with the rhythm of the fight. The world around her blurred as she fought on, her every motion fueled by the need to protect those she loved, the need to protect humanity's future. Her soldiers followed her every step of the way, their determination unbreakable, their trust in her unwavering. They fought not for glory, not for conquest, but for survival, and they would follow her into the heart of the storm. As the Psylocke forces began to falter, Eliana felt the tide of the battle shift, the aliens' once overwhelming advantage now fading beneath the sheer will of the human warriors who fought beside her. They had underestimated the power of humanity's resolve. They had thought the last remnants of her race would fall before them. But they had not counted on Eliana, the warrior who would not break, and the soldiers who would fight until the very last breath. With a final battle cry, Eliana leaped into the air, her sword raised high as the last of the Psylocke ships loomed above her, ready to unleash their final strike. But she was ready. Her sword descended with a roar of fury and a burst of light that shattered the sky. And when the dust settled, the battlefield was silent. The invaders had been vanquished and humanity had won its final victory. The silence that followed the explosion of light was deafening as the last of the Psylocke ships lay broken on the battlefield, the air thick with smoke and the scent of burning metal. The ground was scarred with the remnants of battle. The once fertile land now churned into craters and ash. But despite the destruction, despite the ruin, Eliana stood victorious, her armor still glowing faintly as the dust settled around her. Her sword lowered, but not yet sheathed, the blades still humming with the energy of the final strike. Her chest rose and fell with the rhythm of her breath, each inhale a reminder of the fight she had just waged, each exhale a relief that she had survived the storm. Her soldiers moved slowly through the battlefield, their faces grim yet relieved, as they surveyed the wreckage of the Psylocke fleet, their once oppressive presence now reduced to broken ships and scattered debris. They had fought hard, they had fought with everything they had, but in the end it had been Eliana who had delivered the final blow, and the enemy was no more. The battlefield was littered with the bodies of the invaders, their alien forms twisted and torn from the force of the battle. But there was no time for celebration, not yet, not when so much had been lost. Eliana's gaze swept across the battlefield, her heart heavy with the weight of what they had accomplished and what they had lost. She had been willing to sacrifice everything to protect her people, but even now, as the enemy was defeated, she could feel the emptiness that came with victory. They had won, but at what cost that Ilof were gone, but humanity had been shattered, their cities, destroyed, their families scattered, and their future uncertain. She had given up her crown for this moment, she had abandoned her legacy and her title to become a warrior, and now that the battle was over she wondered if it had been enough. The soldiers who had fought beside her now approached slowly, their faces tired, but filled with respect as they gathered around her. They had seen her fight, they had seen her lead them into the heart of the battle, and they had witnessed the power of humanity's last hope. They understood now that she was not just a queen, but a force of nature, a warrior who had forged her path with blood and steel, one of them, not above them, not apart from them, but one with them, and they honored her for it. "Your Majesty," one of the commanders said, his voice shaky from exhaustion, but laced with reverence. "You've done it, we've done it, humanity lies because of you." Eliana shook her head. The title no longer mattered to her, not in the way it once had. She was not a queen. She was something else now, something that had been forged in the fires of war and sacrifice. "No," she replied, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. "We did it together, every one of you, every soldier, every fighter who stood beside me in this battle. You are the ones who made this victory possible." She paused, looking out across the battlefield at the fallen and the survivors alike. "This is not my victory alone, it belongs to all of us." The commander bowed his head in understanding, and as the other soldiers gathered around her, they too showed their respect, their faces full of gratitude and sorrow. For the cost of their victory, they had saved humanity. But in the process they had lost so much. It was a bittersweet moment, one filled with both triumph and mourning, and Eliana knew that the true battle was only just beginning. The future of humanity was now uncertain. Their world was in ruins, and their people were scattered. They would need to rebuild from the ashes of their former civilization. But Eliana also knew that this was not the end. This was only the beginning of a new chapter, one that would require strength, resilience, and the same unyielding will that had carried them through the final battle. That Ilof were gone, but the scars of war would remain, and it was up to her and the survivors to heal them, to rebuild what had been lost. As she looked out across the battlefield, Eliana felt the weight of her decision to sacrifice her crown. The symbol of her family's legacy had melted away, and in its place, she had become something new, something stronger. And she knew that no matter what the future held, she would face it with the same strength and resolve that had guided her through the darkest days of humanity's struggle. She had become the warrior her people needed, and though the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, she was ready to lead them through it, with her sword in hand, and the memory of those who had fallen driving her forward toward a future that would be forged not from the past, but from the strength of their shared survival. The days that followed the battle were filled with the heavy silence of a world trying to heal. The ruins of cities now stood as grim monuments to humanity's near extinction, their once bustling streets now empty and abandoned as survivors began to gather in the remnants of their old homes. But there was no joy in their victory. That Ilof had been defeated, yes, but the cost had been incalculable. The land was scorched, and the people scattered like ashes in the wind. Those who remained clung to hope, not because they had won, but because they had survived, they had endured, and that in itself was a victory worth fighting for. Eliana stood atop the broken walls of what had once been the royal citadel, her gaze sweeping over the land below. She could still hear the distant cries of those who mourned, the dead, the wounded, the families lost in the chaos of war. She could feel the weight of their grief pressing against her chest, the pain of all those who had given everything for a chance at survival. She had led them into battle, and they had followed her without question. But now she was faced with the reality of what lay ahead: the rebuilding of a fractured world, the healing of broken hearts and minds, and the rekindling of a hope that had been nearly extinguished in the fires of war. Her armor still clung to her like a second skin, its once bright glow now dimmed by the passage of time, and the weight of the losses she had suffered. It had been forged to carry her through the battle. It had been the symbol of her transformation from queen to warrior. But now it felt like a reminder of everything she had sacrificed and everything she had yet to face. She had no crown, no throne to return to, no empire to rebuild, only the shattered remains of what had been her kingdom, and the people who looked to her for leadership. She turned away from the broken citadel, her steps heavy, as she descended the stairs and made her way through the remnants of the once great city. The streets were littered with debris and rubble. The buildings that had once been filled with life now stood empty and cold. The faint hum of activity could be heard in the distance as small groups of survivors began to rebuild their lives. But it was a slow and arduous process. The damage was too great for any one person to fix, and the future was uncertain. As she walked through the streets, she saw the faces of those who had once served her in her court, their eyes hollow with grief, but also filled with a glimmer of hope as they looked upon her. It was as if they saw in her not just a warrior, but a symbol of what they could still be, a reminder that despite everything they had lost, they had not been defeated. They were still standing, they were still fighting, and that was something worth holding on to. Eliana stopped for a moment as she reached the central square where a small group of children were gathered around an old storyteller, his voice carrying through the air as he spoke of the great battles and heroes of the past. The children listened with rapt attention, their faces filled with wonder as they imagined the warriors who had come before them and fought to protect their world. The storyteller's eyes met Eliana's, and for a moment their gazes locked. He nodded to her, as if acknowledging her place in the stories of their future. She smiled softly and then turned away, the weight of her own story now mingling with those of the past. It was strange to think of herself as a hero to these children. She had never asked for this responsibility. It had been thrust upon her by fate and circumstance. But now she realized that perhaps that was how heroes were made, not by choice, but by necessity, when there was no other option but to fight and survive. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching, and she turned to find the commander who had fought alongside her on the front lines. His face was wary, but resolute as he came to stand beside her. "Your Majesty," he said, the title still slipping from his tongue, despite her insistence that it was no longer needed. "The survivors are beginning to gather in the Western colonies. They need leadership, they need direction." Eliana nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon as the weight of the responsibility settled back onto her shoulders. The world was broken, but it was not beyond repair. The people were broken, but they were not lost. They still had the will to survive and to rebuild, and that was all they needed. They would find a way to move forward together. "I'll lead them," she said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty that gnawed at the edges of her resolve. "I will not let humanity fall, not now, not ever." The commander gave her a respectful nod before walking away to deliver the message to the survivors who waited for her direction. Eliana remained in the square for a moment longer, her gaze fixed on the sky above the storm clouds that had gathered after the battle, now beginning to break apart as rays of sunlight pierced through the darkness. She knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but she was ready to face it because she was no longer a queen of a crumbling empire. She was the last warrior of humanity, and she would fight for the future of her people, no matter what it took. With a final glance at the city she had once called home, Eliana turned toward the horizon where the Western colonies awaited their leader. Her steps were sure, her heart filled with both sorrow and determination. The journey was far from over, but she would lead them through the storm and into the light of a new beginning. The journey to the Western colonies was long and treacherous, but Eliana led with unwavering determination, her armor now worn, but still powerful, a reminder of what had been sacrificed to get this far. The path was not easy. The roads were littered with the debris of fallen cities and the remnants of destroyed infrastructure. The world was in ruins, but with each step she took she saw signs of resilience, small pockets of humanity fighting to reclaim what had been lost. They were rebuilding, they were surviving, and that gave her hope. Her soldiers marched alongside her, their faces etched with fatigue, but also with resolve. They had fought the hardest battle of their lives, and though many had fallen, the survivors were stronger now, their unity forged in the fires of war. They were no longer just a scattered group of fighters. They were a family bound together by their shared struggle for survival. Eliana had become their symbol, their leader, not because she was a queen, but because she had proven herself to be one of them. She had shed her crown and become something more, a warrior, a protector, and in her they had found the strength to continue. As they crossed into the Western territories, they were greeted by the leaders of the colonies, who had been waiting for news of the outcome of the war. Eliana's arrival was met with silence at first, and then with cautious hope. The survivors here had heard rumors of the battle, but they had not known if humanity had made it through the Tyloth onslaught alive. When they saw Eliana, their eyes widened in recognition. It was as if they had finally found a beacon in the darkness, a leader who would guide them through the storm. The leader of the Western colonies, an older man with graying hair and a weathered face, stepped forward, his eyes scanning Eliana as if searching for something before he spoke. "You have returned," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We feared you had fallen with the rest of them." Eliana met his gaze, her expression firm, but soft with the weight of everything that had passed. "No, we are still here," she replied, her voice steady and clear. "We have won the battle, but now we face a new fight, a fight to rebuild and to unite what remains of humanity." The colony leader nodded slowly, his face grim but resolute. "We have been waiting for you," he said, "waiting for someone to show us the way forward." Eliana took a deep breath, the weight of her new responsibility settling over her once again. The fight for survival had been won, but now the true challenge began. The survivors of humanity had to come together. They had to rebuild their homes, their communities, their trust in each other. The wounds of the past would take time to heal, and the scars of war would never fully fade. But together, they could create something new, something better. As the days passed, Eliana worked tirelessly alongside the colony leaders to establish a plan for the future. They set up councils and committees to ensure that everyone had a voice in the rebuilding process, and slowly but surely the foundations of a new world began to take shape. The survivors worked together, side by side, to clear the rubble, to plant crops, and rebuild infrastructure. They had no resources, no wealth to draw from, but they had something far more valuable. They had each other, and they had hope. Eliana spent her days traveling from colony to colony, offering support and guidance wherever it was needed. She listened to the concerns of the people and worked to address their needs, but she also reminded them of their shared responsibility to one another. There could be no rebuilding if they remained divided. The unity that had brought them through the war had to be carried into this new chapter of their existence. At night, she would stand alone outside, looking up at the stars. The darkness of space stretched above her, vast and endless, and yet she felt a strange comfort in its silence. She was no longer the queen of a fallen empire. She was something else now, something born of struggle and sacrifice, a leader who would guide humanity into a new age. She had sacrificed her crown, and with it she had become the warrior her people needed, and she would continue to be that warrior, no matter what came next. The sun set on the horizon each day, marking the passage of time, and the slow but steady progress of the rebuilding effort. Humanity was not yet whole, but it was alive, and as long as there was life, there was hope. Eliana knew that the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but she also knew that the strength of her people would carry them through the darkest times, just as it had carried them through the war. And with each passing day, she saw that strength grow in the faces of those around her. They were no longer survivors of a broken world, they were the builders of a new one, and she would lead them to the future they deserved. The journey was far from over, but together they would walk it hand in hand, and no force would ever be able to extinguish their hope again. Years passed since the battle. The world had begun to heal slowly, but surely the scars of war had not vanished. But they were becoming a part of the landscape, now a part of the story that humanity would tell their children. The cities once destroyed by the Tyloth had been rebuilt brick by brick, stone by stone. The land was fertile again, crops grew where there had been only ash, and the people of the Western colonies had become the heart of a new world, their hearts filled with the strength of survival and the hope of renewal. Eliana walked through the streets of the city that had once been her home, her armor now faded, but still worn proudly, a symbol of everything she had fought for. She had become not just a warrior, but a symbol of unity and resilience for all of humanity. She no longer led with a sword in hand, but with wisdom and compassion, as she worked tirelessly to ensure that the future her people were building would be one of peace and cooperation. No longer would they need to fight for survival. They had earned their place in the galaxy, and now they had to protect that future with all their strength. The council of leaders from all the colonies had gathered in the newly rebuilt citadel, a place of unity, where representatives from every corner of humanity came to discuss the future of their world. Eliana stood at the front of the room, her eyes scanning the faces of the people who had once looked to her as their queen. Now they looked to her as a fellow leader, someone who had sacrificed everything for their survival and had helped them build this new future together. The council members spoke of progress and challenges of rebuilding infrastructure and forming alliances with other civilizations in the galaxy. They spoke of the future of humanity and its place among the stars, and Eliana listened with a calm resolve. She had seen the worst of what the universe had to offer, the darkness of war, the brutality of the Axiloth, and yet she knew that humanity was capable of something far greater, something that could never be defeated. No matter how many times they were knocked down, humanity's spirit could never be extinguished. After the meeting, Eliana stood on the balcony of the citadel, looking out over the city she had helped rebuild. The streets were filled with life again. People moved through the market square, children laughed as they played their games, and families gathered for dinner. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the horizon, and for the first time in years, Eliana felt at peace. The weight of the battle had been lifted from her shoulders, and in its place was a sense of fulfillment and knowledge that humanity had not only survived, but had thrived. She was joined by the commander who had fought alongside her in the final battle, his face still weathered by the years, but his eyes filled with pride. He stood beside her in silence for a moment before speaking. "You've done it," he said, his voice full of admiration. "We've done it." Eliana nodded, her gaze still fixed on the city below. "It wasn't just me," she replied softly. "It was all of us. We all fought for this future, for this world." The commander smiled. "Yes, but it was your leadership, your strength that brought us here. You showed us that we could do the impossible, and we did." She turned to face him, her expression somber, but filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you and the others," she said. "We all played our part." They stood there for a moment longer before Eliana spoke again. "It's strange," she said, "to think that this is the world we fought for, a world where peace is possible, where we can rebuild, where the next generation can grow up without knowing the horrors we faced." The commander's eyes softened. "It is strange, but it's beautiful," he said, "and it's something worth protecting." Eliana smiled for the first time in what felt like forever, a genuine smile, one filled with the warmth of hope and possibility. "We will protect it," she said. "Together we will ensure that humanity never forgets the price we paid to get here." The years ahead would not be without their challenges. There would be obstacles to overcome and enemies to face. But Eliana knew one thing for certain: humanity would never again cower in the shadow of fear. They had learned what it meant to fight for their survival and to rebuild from nothing, and with that strength they would face whatever came next. She turned back to the city, the people bustling below, and felt a sense of peace settle over her. The battle had been won, the crown had been sacrificed, and the warrior had become the leader. Humanity had always needed. The road ahead was still uncertain, but it was a road worth walking, and with her people by her side, Eliana knew that there was no force in the universe strong enough to stop them. The future was theirs to shape, and together they would shape it into something that would honor the sacrifices of those who had fallen and the strength of those who had risen to take their place.